So week three of what? We are going through our series called Heroes of Old, which are some of my favorite stories from the Old Testament. Some of them you may have heard, some of them you may not have heard. A lot of these stories I remember as a child. Anybody remember blue felt boards? Maybe yours wasn't a blue felt board, maybe it was a different color, but I remember people being stuck on blue felt boards as Sunday school teachers would tell the stories. I don't necessarily remember all the lessons that went along with it, but I did remember the stories. That's why we tell the stories, is we repeat them over and over again to celebrate God and to learn about His goodness. And it's why we tell our kids these stories, is so hopefully they will learn about the faithfulness of God. So week one, just to review where we've been, we talked about Abraham, right? The patriarch of a great nation which failed to exist prior to God calling Abraham to go to a land where He would show him. In other words, Abraham, I want you to take a trip. I'm not going to tell you where it's going to be. I just want you to follow me. And even though he and Sarah were well beyond childbearing years, God blessed them with a son. And because he trusted in the promise that God had made to him, he started walking, and God turned it into a great nation. Last week, we talked about Moses, right? And Moses was the one who led God's people out of Egypt, out of captivity. But before he did, he spent 40 years in the desert tending sheep, enjoying what we will call a leadership preparation academy. Because he didn't know when God called him that he would spend the next 40 years wandering around in the desert leading God's people, which can sometimes be like sheep. Don't always go where you want them to go. God asked him a question, what's in your hand? And he said a staff, and he said throw it down, and Moses did, and it became the staff of God. This week, Joshua, ankle deep. Before we talk about Joshua, there's a story that just seemed to fit. It came to mind. I don't remember where I heard it. I don't even know if it's true, but it must be, right, since someone told it. Or maybe it was on the internet. And we all know that everything on the internet is true, right? Right. So I can tell this joke because it probably has to do with Kentuckians, because it's about two old hillbillies, fairly young hillbillies, but they were hired by a local farmer to fix his roof on his barn. Now, not a pole barn, but we're talking one of those old wooden structures that would be 2 or 3 stories high and a great big building. And so early the morning that they were hired to do the work, they loaded up their supplies, hammers, nails, extra tin, some tar, some rope, and they climbed up on the roof. They were smart enough to tie themselves off, to each other and to the rafters below in case they would fall. So they worked all morning, stopped for lunch, rested, and then promptly climbed back up their ladder to get back up onto the roof. While they were smart enough to tie themselves off, they weren't smart enough to tie their ladder. And so one accidental kick, and they found themselves up on a barn roof with no way to get down. They were stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no one around. What would they do? How would they get down? We'll come back to them, okay? Let's put today's verses in context of the overall story, because I think it's important that you understand where this story of Joshua fits into the Old Testament hero story. Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, okay, via God parting the Red Sea and making a way where there seemed to be no way, right? They would spend the next 40 years traipsing around in the desert. We're told that the generation of adults who came out of Egypt and witnessed God's powerful hand as adults and experienced God's provision all those years, manna from heaven, water from a rock, that all of these people had died out. They were whiny. They complained for 40 years. We don't like manna. I know we've got food to eat, but we don't like it. They made false gods, worshipped idols. They were disobedient. And so God didn't permit them to enter the promised land, Moses included. So the nation of Israel now consists of an entirely new group of adults after 40 years. And God has chosen as their leader Joshua. And God speaks to Joshua and he says basically this. This is the day that I'm going to begin to lift you up in front of my people. You're going to be their leader. But I want you to obey my commands and stay close to me. I'll tell you what to do. I'll tell you how to lead, but you got to do it. And the people will only follow you as you follow me. You'll be an example, okay? And you'll be responsible for ensuring that my people are faithful to your leading. He's put him in this position of power and authority. And I wonder, did Joshua feel the weight of leadership upon his shoulders? You know, with the mantle of leadership also comes what? Great responsibility, right? Because essentially what he was saying is you're no longer just responsible for yourself. You're responsible for all of my people. It's probably why more people don't step into positions of leadership, don't you think? Because it's easier to follow than it is to step out in front and lead, because what if you get it wrong? I'm sure those were going through Joshua's mind. So the entire nation is camped out on the side of the Jordan River opposite Jericho. When Dolly and I were in the Holy Land, we stood on the ruins of Jericho and could see out over the Jordan River Valley, and you can see for miles. And you can see the Jordan River flow down through. And I could picture the nation. How many people and how big was the nation? Scholars argue between a few 100,000 and a couple of million. The Bible talks about 40,000 soldiers from one of the 12 tribes of Egypt. So regardless of your number, it's more people than I can count are camped out in the Jordan River Valley across from Jericho. You see, a few years earlier, Moses, if you remember the story, had sent 12 spies over into the Promised Land. Remember the story? And these 12 spies came back, and 10 of them said what? We know that you call this the Promised Land, and you said you're giving it to us, but those people over there are giants. There's no way that our army can overtake these people. There were only 2 that said, God's giving us this land. We can do this. One of them was named Caleb. The other one was a young man by the name of Joshua. This time God tells Joshua, I'm giving you this land. Send 2 spies. I guess God figured out that he didn't need 12. He only needed 2 that were positive. And so he didn't want to deal with the other 10. He said, I'm giving you this land. Send them on a mission, a recon mission, over into Jericho. The 2 spies thought they had snuck into the land of milk and honey and the walls of the city undetected. But soon they discovered that the army or soldiers in the city were searching high and low for them. Conveniently, they found themselves in the home of a kind innkeeper named Rahab. Now, Rahab's inn also doubled as her brothel. She was a less than respectable businesswoman. She was an outcast. And she told the spies she would hide them. And so as the soldiers came searching, they said, we know these spies are in your home, Rahab. And she convinced them that they had snuck out over the walls and were headed off to the east. But if they were fast enough, she thought that the soldiers could catch up with these 2 spies. So when the coast was clear, she begged these 2 spies, our people are trembling in fear. We have heard of your great God. We know of his mighty acts. And we know that your God is going to give you our city. When your army comes over, spare me and my family, please. She lowered them down with a rope down the window of her home, which was built into the wall of the city, and they escaped. Coincidentally, Rahab is mentioned in Matthew chapter 1 in that list of begats. Prostitute in the line of King David. A prostitute in the prestigious line of our King Jesus. Which is proof that regardless of your past, God can certainly use all of us if we're willing to move past our past. So the spies report what happened to Joshua. They can assemble. They can take the city. God's giving it to us. They're scared to death. And so Joshua assembles the people and he tells them, consecrate yourselves because tomorrow our God is going to do something great. Consecration. The people needed to purify themselves. This was an Old Testament ritual that's still carried on in Jewish households and Jewish synagogues as a practice today. They were to purify their bodies, their minds, their hearts. And the people obeyed even though they weren't sure exactly what God was going to do. Then Joshua has a conversation with the priest. He says, tomorrow you're going to carry the Ark of the Covenant ahead of all of these people. Usually the army led the people, right? But the priest were going to carry the Ark of the Covenant. I'm not sure how many priests it took to carry the Ark, but inside the Ark of the Covenant were the tablets of Moses, the Ten Commandments, right? That God said, this is how I want you to order your lives. There was a jar of manna, which represented the provision of God. And then there was the staff of Aaron, who was the high priest, as a symbol of the authority of those God had placed in positions of leadership. The large golden box, it's made out of gold, represented the power and presence of God among the entire nation. And it was their most prized possession. So they're going to lead them somewhere. Typically, you wouldn't lead a nation into hostile territory with your most prized possession in front, would you? Priest, I'm sure, wondered, how long is this journey going to take? Are you sure you want us out in front? Because we're priests. We're carrying this Ark of the Covenant. There's no way that if something happens in battle that we can defend ourselves. And Joshua tells me you'll find out soon enough. So morning comes, and the priest led the people with the Ark of God. And when they reached the Jordan River, we're told it's at flood stage. So regardless of what you picture as flood stage and how wide and rushing the river is, there's still water there, okay? And Joshua tells the priest to wade out into the water with the ark. And I wonder if their response wasn't, you want us to do what? Because there's flowing water. Well, all right, but how far do we need to get out into this water? You know, we're in the front, Joshua. You know, how about those guys in the back? How far do we need to get out in the water? And I picture Joshua saying, wade on out there about ankle deep. Just enough to take some steps of faith to see what God's going to do. And I wonder if Joshua knew what God was going to do. Because all he knew is he was told to have the priest lead the people with the Ark of the Covenant. But we're told whenever all the priests were in the river, the waters parted once again. It says it stood up in a great heap at this town called Adam, miles up, and it quit flowing down to the river. And I would imagine, you know, I picture what we see with like the Red Sea on TV, you know, the water standing up on both sides. But if you're talking a couple 100,000 or maybe even a couple million people to cross over, I'm guessing a stretch of a couple 100 yards wasn't enough. It was a dry river. People passed over on dry ground. They took 12 large stones from the river, and they set them up as a monument to their God and his great power. The priests came up from the dry riverbed, and the water began to flow again. Wow. Two thoughts kind of come to mind with that. Can you imagine being part of the people of God witnessing water stop flowing and walking across on dry ground. Wouldn't you feel like we can do anything? This is a miracle. Yay, God. I bet they stopped right there and wrote 20 new hymns and worship songs and had church right there. And that's probably what they did. Wouldn't you think? Second, can you imagine being on the other side of the river? Those people in Jericho. Because you had to see this massive group of people crossing a river that's no longer flowing. Wouldn't you think we're in trouble? My gosh. How can we switch teams and be a part of their team? I want to be a part of what God is doing, which is what naturally happens whenever God begins to act in a mighty way among his people, which we call the church. People naturally want to join us. But most of the time, we've got to get about ankle deep in that water right before we see it part, which requires some shaky steps. But when they see that water part, they naturally want to be a part of it, don't they? How many of you knew that God parted the Red Sea? Rhetorically speaking, that you knew God parted the water a second time. It's an amazing story to me. So our two hillbillies are stuck on top of the barn. One of them sits wringing his hands, thinking we're never going to get off the barn. The other one begins to pray and ask God to give him the wisdom and guidance to get down off of this barn. He believes he hears the answer because he begins to survey around the barn and he sees a compost pile and thinks, that would be soft enough to break our fall. We could jump and land in this compost pile. Now, for those of you that are not country people, that's a nice way of saying it was the manure pile that they were going to use for fertilizer on the garden later in the year. So the leader, who hears from God, he says to his buddy, I'm going to go first and jump, because that's what leaders do, right? And I'll holler back up here and tell you, how deep it is, and then you follow. The guy says, okay. 1, 2, 3, and he jumps. And he hollers back up to his friend on the roof, the hillbilly, and he says, it's about ankle deep, and it's soft. Come on. So trusting the leader. The second one, 1, 2, 3, jumps and sinks in almost up to his eyeballs. Now, for those of you who aren't laughing, the first one had dove in head first. And ankle deep was about from the perspective of whether or not you were diving in head first or feet first. And often obeying God is about perspective. And as leaders, it's about communication. And usually it's about trust that's built up over time. Joshua and the priests and the Israelites had a history with this God. They had seen him act in a powerful way. And Joshua had a history of being a faithful follower of God. So whenever God said, I'm choosing you as my leader, the people said, we'll follow. So what do we do with all this? I think there's a few really simple lessons from this. First, it all started with consecrate yourselves. Before God acted in the Old Testament, he would tell the leader to have the people consecrate themselves. So if you're expecting or anticipating God's hand in your life, you got to clean up your heart of sin. Maybe let go of some past hurts and some past failures. In the New Testament, we call that repentance, right? Simplified explanation for this is trade in all your old junk for a clean heart and a fresh start. Same holds true for a church, right? If we're anticipating God to use us to reach our community and bring hope to the hopeless and help to the helpless, then we need to start by first cleaning up our own acts and take a look at ourselves and consecrate ourselves. Second lesson is more of a question. Are you standing perhaps on the edge of your own Jordan River? Metaphorically speaking. Is God leading you somewhere that you're not sure you want to go? and you're a bit scared about wading in the water and wondering, if you get out there about ankle deep, is God going to part the waters? For church, I kind of think that's where we stand. I'm not exactly sure where we're moving to, but I'm getting the sense that we're being led to take some risks and wade in ankle deep. Last principle is pretty simple yet profound. The nation of Israel could not remain on one side of the Jordan River and claim the promised land that God was giving them. You cannot stay where you are and move to where God wants you to be. It's an impossibility. And we as a church cannot remain exactly who we are right now or who we have been if we intend to grow into the community of faith that God intends for us to be. So I guess the message of ankle deep is pretty simple. Consecrate yourselves, because the Lord is about to do amazing things in and through His people called Hillside.